In the summer of 2001, a truck rolled to a stop at the edge of the Kalamaili Nature Reserve in northwest China. The tailgate dropped. 27 horses stood frozen for a moment at the threshold of the Gobi, staring out at a landscape none of them had ever set a hoof on. Then, one by one, they walked forward into ancestral land their species had not touched in more than 3 decades. These were Przewalski's horses, the only truly wild horse species left on the planet. And what happened to this small, fragile herd over the next 2 decades would challenge one of the most expensive environmental strategies China had ever attempted, and offer a strange, hoofed answer to a question scientists have been asking for 50 years. Can you actually undo a desert? To understand why anyone thought releasing zoo-raised horses into the Gobi was a good idea, you first need to understand what had happened to the land itself. The Yungar Basin in China's Xinjiang region sits in the rain shadow of some of the tallest mountains on Earth. It has always been arid, but by the second half of the 20th century, it was getting worse, and it wasn't alone. By the year 2000, close to 27% of China's entire landmass was classified as desertified land, arid and semi-arid terrain that had lost its capacity to support vegetation, largely as a result of overgrazing, unsustainable farming, and drought. That expansion was swallowing thousands of square kilometers of grassland and topsoil every year, and pushing dust storms deep into China's eastern cities. China's answer, launched in 1978, was audacious in scale. The 3 North Shelter Belt program, nicknamed the Green Great Wall. The plan was to plant a belt of trees more than 4,500 kilometers long across the country's arid north, eventually covering tens of millions of hectares, in an attempt to physically block the advancing sand. It remains one of the largest reforestation efforts ever undertaken by any government on Earth. But the Green Great Wall came with a complication that took decades to fully appreciate. Trees are thirsty. In many of the driest stretches of northern China, the fast-growing poplar and pine used in shelter belt planting pulled groundwater out of soils that could not easily replace it, and survival rates for young trees in the harshest zones were often poor. Researchers and critics, including scholars writing as early as the 2000s, pointed out that a monoculture of introduced trees was, in some places, mismatched to an ecosystem that had evolved around grasses and shrubs, not forest. Even decades in, independent assessments found that the total share of China's desertified land had dropped only marginally, from around 27.2% to roughly 26.8% over a 10-year stretch. The wall of trees was slowing the desert in places. It was not reversing it. It was against this backdrop, decades of enormous investment producing only partial results, that a very different kind of proposal reached Chinese conservation officials in the mid-1980s. Stop trying to hold the desert back with trees, and instead put back the animal that had shaped this landscape for tens of thousands of years before it vanished. The Przewalski's horse, pronounced Przewalski, and sometimes called the Taki, is not simply a wild-looking horse. It is genetically a different animal from every domestic horse on Earth. Domestic horses carry 64 chromosomes. Przewalski's horses carry 66. When the two interbreed, the offspring, unusually for a hybrid with an odd chromosome count, are typically fertile, carrying 65. Mitochondrial DNA studies suggest the Przewalski's lineage split from the ancestors of domestic horses roughly 500,000 years ago, according to research summarized by the Smithsonian's National Zoo and Conservation Biology Institute. Stocky, dun-colored, with a short upright mane, no forelock, and faint striping on the legs, they look almost exactly like the horses painted on cave walls by Ice Age humans, because they are essentially a living relic of that world. They very nearly didn't survive into ours. Western collectors captured the last wild-caught founders of today's population around the turn of the 20th century, and the entire modern global population traces back to a tiny handful of individuals, commonly cited as around a dozen true wild-caught founders. The population was hit by a severe genetic bottleneck in the 1930s, and hit again during the Second World War, when the number of breeding animals worldwide dropped to roughly 20. By 1969, sightings of Przewalski's horses in the wild, in Mongolia and the border regions of China, had stopped entirely. The species was functionally extinct outside of zoos. What kept it alive was decades of careful, deliberate captive breeding. International stud books tracking every individual's lineage since 1959 and a program of exchanging breeding animals between zoos to manage what little genetic diversity remained. By the 1980s, the global population had recovered into the hundreds, still entirely captive, but stable enough that conservationists in several countries began asking the next question. Could any of them go home? China's reintroduction effort was launched in 1985, built around a facility called the Jimsar Wild Horse Breeding Center in Xinjiang, with a parallel breeding program established at the Gansu Endangered Species Research Center, according to research published by the Xinjiang Institute of Ecology and Geography at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Between 1985 and 2005, a total of 24 Przewalski's horses, 14 males and 10 females, were brought in from Western zoos to found the Xinjiang breeding population, based on a detailed account published in the journal Biological Conservation. The plan followed a deliberate three-stage design: bring in captive-born horses and acclimatize them, transition them into large semi-wild enclosures where they could relearn behaviors zoo life had stripped away, and only then release them into fully wild terrain. It was, in effect, an attempt to reteach an entire species how to be wild again, one generation at a time. The first foal born on Chinese soil arrived in 1988. It would take 13 more years and hundreds more births before any horse from this program set foot outside a fence enclosure. That moment came on August 28, 2001, when the first group, 27 horses, was released from the Jimsar Breeding Center into the Kalamaili Nature Reserve, a rugged, arid, protected area covering thousands of square kilometers of Yungar Basin steppe and desert, as reported by state media and confirmed in peer-reviewed accounts of the project. It was the first time in more than 3 decades that a Przewalski's horse had walked free in this stretch of Central Asia. It did not go perfectly, and researchers were honest about that from the start. The newly released herd was still, in the words of the scientists who studied it, only a semi-wild population. Horses were allowed to range freely across the reserve for most of the year, but in winter they were driven back into a protected enclosure so that staff could provide supplemental food and reduce fatal competition with the domestic horses that local herders also grazed on the reserve. Xinjiang winters are brutal, and a species raised for generations on hay from a bucket does not simply remember, overnight, how to find water and forage under snow. But the herd held. More releases followed. By December 2013, a total of 127 Przewalski's horses had been released into Kalamaili since the program began, according to the Biological Conservation study tracking the project's progress. Natural breeding was occurring in the wild population, not just in the captive herd back at the breeding center, meaning the released horses were not just surviving, they were successfully raising the next generation on the reserve itself. The ecological logic behind putting horses, rather than trees, into a collapsing grassland rests on a body of rewilding science that has been observed across multiple ecosystems, not just this one. Large grazing herbivores don't just eat vegetation. Over evolutionary time, they become part of the machinery that keeps arid and semi-arid grasslands functioning. Hoofed animals moving across dry, compacted ground physically break up hardened soil crusts, creating small depressions that catch rain before it can evaporate or run off, and giving seeds points of contact with bare earth where they can actually germinate. Their grazing, when it isn't overgrazing, tends to be selective and patchy rather than uniform. They crop some patches hard and leave others long, creating a mosaic of different vegetation heights that in turn supports a wider range of insects, birds, and small mammals than a uniform stand of grass or a monoculture forest plantation ever could. And their manure does double duty as both fertilizer and a seed dispersal mechanism. Undigested seeds pass through a large herbivore's gut and are deposited, along with a package of moisture and nutrients, often at meaningful distances from the parent plant. This general pattern, ecosystem engineering by large native herbivores, is well documented in rewilding literature covering species from American bison to European Wisent to African elephants. And it is the same underlying logic conservationists point to when explaining why the Przewalski's horse reintroduction was framed as more than just a species rescue project. It was framed as an attempt to restore a missing ecological process, not just a missing animal. That distinction, process versus population, is what separated this project conceptually from the tree planting campaigns running in parallel across northern China. A shelter belt of poplars, however large, is a static barrier. A self-sustaining herd of wild horses is a living system that, if it survives, keeps doing the work of grassland maintenance indefinitely, without further human input, and without pulling groundwater the way water-hungry tree plantations can. The scale-up over the following 2 decades has been steady rather than explosive, and it has come with real setbacks along the way. Disease, harsh winters, and competition with domestic livestock for the reserve's limited winter forage have all been documented challenges in the scientific literature on the project. By the end of 2018, researchers reported that China's Xinjiang population had reached 413 Przewalski's horse descendants in total, split across 3 stages of the reintroduction pipeline. 89 still in the breeding paddocks of the Jimsar Center, 102 living semi-free within the center's larger fenced enclosures, and 221 living as a rewild population inside the Kalamaili Nature Reserve itself, according to a status report on China's reintroduction program. The program has also expanded beyond Xinjiang. Separate reintroduction efforts, using descendants retranslocated from a breeding herd at Beijing's Nanhazi Milla Park, have established additional populations in Gansu Province, at the Anqi Extreme Arid Desert Nature Reserve and the Dunhuang West Lake Nature Reserve, giving China 3 geographically distinct wild and semi-wild Przewalski's horse populations, rather than a single herd concentrated in one reserve, which matters for long-term genetic resilience. The most recent public figures suggest the growth has continued. State media reporting from April 2026 described a fresh release of 30 additional Przewalski's horses into the Kalamaili Nature Reserve after they completed rewilding training, and cited the wild population within Xinjiang alone as having grown to 392 individuals, more than 40 years after the first horses arrived at Jimsar, and a quarter century after that first group of 27 walked free in 2001. China's program was not the only one of its kind. Mongolia reintroduced Przewalski's horses to its own protected areas beginning in the early 1990s, and Kazakhstan has run its own reintroduction efforts as well, drawing on the same small pool of captive founders and the same international stud book system that had kept the species alive through the 20th century. Collectively, these programs have helped move the species' official conservation status. It has gone from being listed as extinct in the wild to critically endangered to, more recently, endangered, a rare example of a downgrade in threat level for a large mammal. It would be an overstatement to say that a few hundred horses reversed desertification across an area the size of the Yungar Basin. The scientists who have actually run the long-term monitoring on this project are careful in their published work to describe it as a genuinely promising but still incomplete success. The Kalamaili population remains, by the researchers' own description, semi-wild rather than fully wild. It still depends on winter supplemental feeding. It still competes with domestic herds that graze the same reserve. And industrial development pressure on the reserve's best winter pasture has been flagged as an ongoing threat to the project's long-term stability. But set against the scale of what the Green Great Wall's tree planting approach has managed to achieve after nearly 50 years and tens of billions of trees, a modest, low single-digit reduction in the total share of China's decertified land. The horse reintroduction represents something different in kind rather than just in scale. It is not a barrier erected against the desert. It is an attempt to put a functioning piece of the original ecosystem back into place and let it do the work that trees, by themselves, were never built to do in a grassland that had evolved around grazing animals, not forest canopy. The story of these horses is, in the end, a story about a very specific kind of humility. The recognition arrived at only after decades of expensive engineering solutions that the answer to an ecological collapse sometimes isn't a bigger human intervention. Sometimes it's putting back the piece that was removed in the first place, and then getting out of the way. 27 horses walked into the Kalamaili Reserve in the summer of 2001. For decades after the program that made that moment possible first began, their descendants number in the hundreds, spread across 3 regions of China. still walking the same ground their ancestors were driven from a lifetime ago.